Welcome to this webinar on post-market clinical follow-up presented by Global Regulatory Writing and Consulting and Purdie Pascoe, the PMCF survey experts. My name is Kristen Petersen. I'm a manager and CER specialist at Global Regulatory Writing and Consulting. Let's get started by reviewing PMCF requirements. Manufacturers must manage their devices throughout the entire life cycle of the device. This includes everything from design and development through post-market surveillance and subsequent process changes. We know that manufacturers must maintain a CE mark for devices. In order to maintain the CE mark, clinical evaluation reports, or CERs, must be submitted at regular intervals. Manufacturers are also responsible for ongoing monitoring of their device. This is accomplished through post-market surveillance and post-market clinical follow-up activities. MDR places a heavy emphasis on clinical evidence. In order to collect these data, manufacturers must have processes in place to ensure there is sufficient clinical data for a robust clinical evaluation. These processes are particularly important in situations in which there is inadequate data to fully assess safety and performance and intended clinical benefits of the device. When we look at clinical evaluation, it is important to remember that this is a continual analysis and assessment of clinical data and verification of safety, performance, and benefits. If these processes identify that the available clinical evidence is not sufficient, there needs to be a procedure in place for collecting additional clinical data, and this will be your PMCF. Here we can take a look at the evolving requirements of PMCF from the MDD to the MDR. Under the MDR, manufacturers have to include a PMCF plan as part of their post-market surveillance process. If PMCF is not appropriate, this can be justified, but PMCF is a discrete and specific requirement. The MDR outlines some clear guidance for the PMCF in Annex 14. 1. PMCF is a continuous process that should be included in the PMS plan. 2. PMCF should confirm safety and performance throughout the expected lifetime of the device, with the understanding that there may be changes to the device. 3. PMCF must ensure continued acceptability of identified risks. And 4. The PMCF plan must define methods and procedures of device monitoring. The PMCF plan must include a rationale for the appropriateness of the methods used, objectives to be addressed by the PMCF, a plan to capture and evaluate clinical data relating to equivalent or similar devices, relevant and appropriate references, and a detailed and justified time schedule, particularly as it relates to the expected device lifetime. The results of these activities feed into multiple documents, such as your PMCF report, your CER, and risk management documents. Now that we know that we need a plan for the PMCF, the first step is to determine what kind of activities are needed. For this, you'll want to perform a gap analysis with respect to MDR requirements. You'll want to examine currently available clinical evidence to determine what post-market activities are appropriate for the device class and type. If current post-market data on the device is not adequately comprehensive, new data may need to be generated, even if the devices are well established and have been on the market for several decades. This enables an evaluation of their safety and clinical performance in relation to an evolving state of the art. PMCF activities can be specific or general. One of the trickier parts of interpreting the MDR is the use of the word specific. Specific is a word that is used frequently but is not defined. We can think of specific activities as those that are designed to answer specific questions about the device. If the PMCF data is designed to answer specific questions, then the activity is specific. If not, we would consider the activity to be general. The risk class and number and type of unknowns will drive the need for specific PMCF. Higher risk devices are going to require more specific PMCF to accurately verify the risk-benefit profile. Devices with more unknowns will also require more specific PMCF designed to address the unknowns. It is important to note that higher risk does not always correlate with more unknowns. Higher risk devices could be well understood and have few unknowns, while lower risk devices could have numerous unknowns. PMCF activities can take many forms. As we move from the left side of the screen to the right, we can see some activities that are always general, such as a literature review and complaints. Activities that could be general or specific depending on their structure and design, such as surveys, focus groups, and extended follow-up. And activities that are always going to be considered specific, such as studies and registries. Later on in this presentation, Marcus from Purdie Pascoe will share more information about PMCF surveys. In certain cases, a PMCF study might be required. This could include situations in which a CE mark was granted based on claiming equivalence to another device, if a device constitutes a novel technology, if the long-term safety or performance of the device is unknown, if the device is intended to be used in a high-risk population, and if there are significant changes to the device or its intended use. However, in many situations, specific PMCF is not required. If the device's long-term safety and performance is known, if the device was marked under MDD and there are no concerning trends identified, and if the risk-benefit ratio is acceptable and based on sufficient clinical data. The MDCG guidance outlines the clinical evidence that is needed for devices that were previously CE marked under the MDD. This guidance outlines a clear hierarchy of clinical evidence. Ranks 1 through 4 have the highest strength, but all ranks can be used to support demonstration of conformity with the GSPRs. In particular, rank 4 and rank 8 include types of clinical data that are directly relevant to PMCF surveys. High quality surveys that are appropriately designed to address device unknowns can constitute evidence rank 4. General surveys can support PMS data collection activities and serve as general PMCF data. Now I will turn the time over to Marcus to discuss considerations for successful PMCF survey implementation.
Thanks, Kristen, for the introduction and the excellent start to this presentation. As mentioned, I'm going to be talking about PMCF surveys here and considerations for successful implementation. To start with, I'll quickly introduce myself. So my name is Marcus Torr, and I'm the PMCF lead at a company called Purdie Pascoe based out of London in the UK. We help support medical device manufacturers implement PMCF surveys right through from design, planning, implementation, and then also the data analysis and the reporting, having conducted well over 300 surveys since 2019. So this may be a little bit of duplication from Kristen's presentation, but I think it's a good reminder of where PMCF sits within the EU MDR. So the medical device regulation, you can see in the red text at the top, considers PMCF as a continuous process that will be used to update clinical evaluation. I think that's really important to mention that it is continuous and that the data collected will be used to update clinical documentation. So you can see on the left-hand side here, I mentioned that for PMCF, manufacturers now need to be proactive in assessing the safety and performance continuously through that product lifecycle. And it is a cyclical process. You need to create the PMCF plan, you need to collect PMCF data, analyze that data and prepare your PMCF report, and then use that data and the learnings from that to update relevant documentation, such as your risk management, your PMCF plans, and your clinical evaluation reports. It doesn't stop there though, because you will need to continually reassess, evaluate, and identify any gaps in that clinical documentation to go again and create a PMCF on a regular basis throughout that product lifecycle, and that process will keep on going. On the right-hand side, I've got the aims of PMCF. So it is important that if you're ever collecting PMCF data, you're aligning and approaching it in a way that can collect data against these aims. So you need to confirm the safety and performance, identify any previously unknown side effects, identify and analyze any emergent risks, and ensure the continued acceptability of the benefit-risk ratio, alongside identifying any possible systematic misuse or off-label use. In terms of PMCF data collection, there's many different ways of doing so. There isn't a right and wrong way, but you do need to justify and provide rationale for what you're doing. There are more generic PMCF methods, such as literature reviews, publications, general user feedback, and also general level 8 PMCF surveys. And then there's more specific methods. So clinical investigations and registries being probably a gold standard, investigator-initiated studies, but also surveys that fall under level 4 clinical evidence and can be described as high quality PMCF surveys fall into this. There's pros and cons to both. The generic methods, albeit the evidence may be lesser, the time, the effort, and the cost that is associated with it is much lesser also. It's cheaper and it's quicker. The specific methods, though, are going to provide you with a higher level of evidence, but the time, effort, and the cost associated is going to be much greater. In terms of justifying which you're going to use, it is important to base that on many different factors, such as your device, risk classification, previous clinical data, and so on. So I'm going to be talking about PMCF surveys and where do they sit in terms of the levels of evidence. So here I've got the hierarchy of clinical data and evidence, with the highest level being rank 1. So you can see the definition here is high quality clinical investigations, all the way down to rank 12, which is preclinical and bench testing. When you're looking at PMCF data, in reality, you're going to have to be looking for a minimum of level 8 data. And this is where the general usability survey sits. It's defined as proactive PMS data, such as that derived from surveys. Whereas if you look up for higher risk class devices, so class 2B or class 3, the minimum level of data you need to collect is level 4. And this is described as outcomes from studies with potential methodological flaws, but where data can still be quantified and acceptably justified. High quality case or patient-specific surveys sit under this level 4 rank. It's really important that you design a survey that can be justified as level 4. It needs to be statistically justified. It needs to have acceptance criteria and very specific endpoints and questions. So looking at both of these different survey approaches, we've got the general usability surveys on the left-hand side. So as mentioned, these are used for much lower risk devices or those with smaller clinical gaps. Whereas the high quality case specific surveys level 4, they're used for much higher risk devices or those that have larger clinical gaps. In terms of how they differ in the approach, the general surveys, you're looking at screening users on or asking users about usage of a device across a set time period, so the last month or even the last 12 months. So each survey represents multiple device usages, and you're asking respondents to recollect information and be a lot more general in terms of questions on usability and so on. This will be a completion of a one-off survey by each individual respondent, being solely retrospective, and this means that that is actually much quicker and cheaper to implement. However, the level of evidence will be lesser due to that recollective nature. The high quality surveys, they differ because now what you're looking at is you're potentially screening users on not only previous usage, but also upcoming and prospective usage. Each survey, rather than representing multiple usages, represents one individual patient or case in which that device was used. and each respondent can complete multiple surveys based on the number of cases they may have used the device in, meaning this can be a mix of retrospective and prospective. And the benefit of this, you get a much higher, more reliable level of evidence. However, the data collection will be over a longer time period and likely be more expensive. So we're going to look at the benefits of surveys. I've mentioned already, they're quicker and they're also cheaper versus other methods like clinical investigations and registries. You have the ability to reach and receive feedback from a vast amount of your customers virtually across the globe as well. It is an approved method by the notified bodies and it's here to stay. There's flexibility in the approach, so you can look at the level 8 general recollective feedback or the more sort of higher level case specific level 4 data. It gives you the option as well to provide additional feedback that can help other business decisions. So maybe looking at some marketing questions you add in there. I would caveat that to say be very careful of not going too far along the lines of turning this into a marketing survey, though. It needs to be very focused on your objectives, which would be safety and performance objectives. And there's many companies out there like ourselves with existing experience that can help implement these. As with anything, though, there are limitations. I would never say that survey data is sufficient if used as a sole data source. You should be having literature reviews and other methods of data collection that can help build that story for your device. There is a lack of documented guidance out there that can help surveys difficult to plan, especially around sample sizing and acceptance criteria. Recollective surveys aren't patient and case specific, so you need to make sure you're conscious of that if you're going down that route. It can be difficult to reach and recruit end users. And if the manufacturer is recruiting end users themselves, there is a potential for bias there. As with a survey, I would recommend it being as concise as possible. Don't make it overly burdensome for respondents, and that means you do have a limited number of questions you can ask. And with everything with PMCF, what this means is that manufacturers are collecting more data. And also because there's lots of safety data, or you're potentially collecting adverse events and complications. So this increased data collection is a resulting burden on your complaint handling teams. So make sure they're aware of this before you go down the route of PMCF surveys or PMCF data collection. So I mentioned that surveys are cost effective. They certainly are. They're a really, really good method of collecting PMCF data quickly and pretty cheaply compared to others. However, we have heard lots of mixed opinions on whether surveys are an appropriate method of PMCF data collection. Simple answer is they are. The issue, from our experience, is that those that have had limited success is there's one key similarity: poor and inadequate planning. People look at cost effective and only think about the cost part. They rush into doing a survey because it's cheap and it's quick, but they don't plan properly, they don't put the time, and they actually don't put the cost into planning properly to make sure that it's not only cost or effective, not just the cost part of cost effective, but it's also an effective method. Without proper planning or consideration for the design of the survey to make sure it's appropriate, surveys can quickly become expensive, especially if you need to repeat them or disregard the data you've collected. So I'd always recommend make sure you speak to the right people, put the time into the planning, because if you do that in the first instance, it means in the future, remember PMCF is continuous, it's going to help down along the road. You'll make it not just a cheap solution, you'll make it a cost-effective solution. So I mentioned our experience and expertise previously. We've been helping manufacturers conduct surveys since 2019. We've done well over 300 surveys across many different types of devices, therapy areas, and risk classifications. We do conduct surveys both level 4 and level 8 data, and we've got expertise in design, implementation, and reporting. So quickly, I'm going to look at some key considerations for surveys shortly, but I want to just run through what the survey process really looks like from a manufacturer side, and also if you're going to look to get a third party involved as well to support that implementation. This is a linear process, but in reality, it should be cyclical because, as we mentioned earlier, the data you do collect in PMCF is going to feed back in to your initial PMCF plan. But if we start on the left-hand side here, you'll see that it's important. You're doing PMCF data because your device is on the market. So you'll have a clinical evaluation report completed. You'll then start needing to identify any gaps in that documentation and feed that into a PMCF plan. If your PMCF plan suggests that a survey is an appropriate method, you're going to need to then move on to thinking about your survey protocol or your survey plan, which should outline the methodology and the sample size. It should outline endpoints and acceptance criteria. And then what you can do is feed that into your actual survey design. So make sure that you'll have inclusion criteria, so the right people are going to be responding, and then design your questions. Your questions must align with your endpoints. Like I said, don't fall into a marketing survey, make sure it's focused. Once your survey is approved and designed, you can then get that survey programmed, so it's online and can be launched and sent out to relevant respondents. It's important to work out how you're going to identify and distribute the survey. Are you going to use a third party? Do you have the contacts internally yourself? And when you are in field work, who's going to be monitoring that field work? Who's going to be checking the data to make sure it looks appropriate? Who's going to be doing follow-ups if you need to? And then also, as that data is coming in, you need to process the data, put it in a way of tabulating and analyzing that data statistically, which you can then feed into your PMCF reports. Once you have your PMCF report ready, it's important to update the relevant documentation, such as your clinical evaluation report, risk management documentation, and also, like I said earlier, bring in complaint handling. Once you've got that, you can then go again, identify clinical gaps, update your PMCF plan, and work out what the appropriate methods of PMCF data collection will be next time round. So finally, I'm going to look at some key considerations and then some common pitfalls when it comes to surveys. So here we're going to look at objectives and endpoints, sample sizing, survey design, and compliance. So initially, let's look at the objectives and endpoints. You must have well-defined safety and performance objectives. And within that, your primary and secondary endpoints must be aligned with those survey objectives. Usually your primary endpoint is going to be around performance. It's going to be looking at technical success. So what is your anticipated or acceptable technical success rate you need to be collecting from your survey? And the secondary endpoint is usually around safety. So adverse events, complications, are there any rates that you need to make sure you hit? And then, like I said, alongside those endpoints, you need to set acceptance criteria. It's really important to review literature, which can help determine acceptable parameters, or look at similar benchmark devices, state of the art, across on the market. Next up was sample sizing. So over the last few years, there's been a much greater emphasis from notified bodies to ensure that sample sizes are statistically justified. The basis for that justification usually feeds from your clear objectives, your endpoints, and your acceptance criteria, and you base the calculations on usually your acceptance criteria, your primary endpoints, looking at non-inferiority calculations and so on. It's also important when you've got your sample size justified or statistically, you need to consider who you're going to target. So specialties and also which countries are you going to target and how best to recruit the participants to ensure that you can feasibly get up to that sample size in a cost-effective manner as well. The survey design itself, you must ensure, like I said, your survey questions focus on your objectives and endpoints. If they don't, you're going to get data that won't be appropriate and you won't be able to use it. When we look at the level 4 high quality surveys, they must have a much more sort of clinical focus and be very specific in the questioning rather than usability, which is usually around those sort of general level 8 surveys. But at the same time, it's important to make sure your survey isn't too long and burdensome. If you do so, you're just not going to get accurate data. The respondents will get tired, and you're not going to get data that you can use appropriately. Finally, it's important to think about compliance. This is European regulation. You're collecting European data. You're collecting safety data. You may be collecting contact information. So think about GDPR and data privacy considerations. Ensure your work is conducted in line with GCP, looking at ISO 14155. If you're collecting patient identifiable information, you need to consider how you can do that. Are there any approvals needed, for example? And if you are sharing data such as patient identifiable information or personal data, you need to make sure they're being transferred securely as well. I mentioned earlier that there's mixed opinions on surveys, and I can see why. Usually, again, it's that poor planning. I mentioned it here. What are the common pitfalls that mean that manufacturers maybe don't conduct or implement their surveys correctly? The biggest one is poor planning. The next one is statistical justification. We're going to look at coverage of all sizes and variants as well, and then also identifying and recruiting the end users. So starting with this planning, when there is a lack of consideration in regard to appropriateness of a PMCF survey, there's bad news in the start. Don't just rush into a survey because it is the cheapest method or the quickest method. You should do a survey if it's the right method. So really think about that justification. And if you are going to do a survey, like I said, invest in the time and the resource to develop a proper survey plan and protocol. If you get that planning right, your survey will be designed properly and the data you get will be able to be used and accepted by the notified bodies. With that planning, make sure you have to outline the proper safety and performance objectives and endpoints. We very regularly see manufacturers come to us and say, these are the questions we want, but they're not in line with any safety and performance objective. I mentioned statistical justification is a tricky one, and it's hard for manufacturers to know how to plan. With sample sizes, 4 years ago, maybe you could have plucked sample size out of thin air, but now you need to make sure there's statistical rationale. There's a lack of foresight as how the data from the survey will then align with the endpoints and acceptance criteria. So if you don't just look at the statistics to pull a sample size, you need to then feed that back into what does that mean when you look at your confidence intervals, your lower bounds, your upper bounds of the data you're collecting. Statistical justification is really important, but if you need to also consider the feasibility. For example, it might give you a number, a really large sample size. So let's imagine 1,000 surveys need to be completed. What happens though if your device has only been sold, let's say 500 times in the last year? Is it actually feasible to get that sample size? So you need to make sure there's a balance between what is driven by statistics and also feasibility. Coverage of all sizes and variants. Now, this is so important. We regularly see manufacturers come and do a survey and they collect data on their, let's say it's a catheter, and they get their mid-size catheter. All the data is on that mid-size. Is that sufficient though? Because potentially there could be a greater risk with the larger size or the smaller size. So you need to ensure that you get sufficient data gathered across all device sizes and variants. And if there are any specific clinical gaps in your clinical documentation now, make sure you target these within the survey. So it may not just also be sizes and variants, it may be age groups. So there may not be much clinical data on use in pediatric patients. Maybe this is something you should ensure that at least you collect some data on this within your survey. And finally, looking at how to identify and recruit end users. I mentioned you need to consider feasibility. So consider sales volumes. Look at sales volumes in terms of what markets you're going to target. Maybe targeting those with just the higher sales, or at least a handful, so you get representation, but you're not paying for translation fees across every single market in which you sell the device. Also, it's important to have backup and supplementation plans in place to ensure the sample size is met. So, for example, if you can't get it across Europe, maybe you can utilize non-EU markets, such as the US. The US is a good one. It's accepted by the notified bodies because the patient characteristics and the use of the device is not dissimilar from how it would be in Europe. And then finally, how will the survey actually reach the end user? Do you have contacts yourself, or do you need to look at other recruitment methods through third parties and databases of healthcare professionals? And if so, how do you ensure they're the right people? You need to screen them appropriately to make sure the right people qualify for the survey. So that's all from me in terms of the key considerations for PMCF surveys. I'm going to hand back over to the global team to look at how you can use survey data and incorporate that once the data has been collected. So thanks very much. Thanks for your time, and If you have any questions, please feel free to get in contact with me.
Now that we have PMCF survey data, let's talk about how to incorporate it. As we discussed earlier, PMCF is an ongoing cyclical process. Once PMCF has been established and the data collected, the data needs to be compiled and analyzed in the PMCF report. Additionally, the PMCF data should feed into other documents in the technical file, including risk management, design documents, labeling, PMS and PMCF plans, and the CER. PMCF data are required to be detailed in a standalone report, and MDCG 2020-8 gives us a PMCF report template that should be used or referenced. The PMCF report should follow the prepared PMCF plan and in turn be used to update the IFU and risk management report and feed into the CER, PSUR, and SSCP. In your PMCF report, be sure to include a justified time schedule for updates based on rationale related to the expected device lifetime. From the PMCF plan, the CER should be updated with a clear description of PMCF activities and their purpose. And from the PMCF report, the CER should capture data that results from PMCF activities. If possible, discuss data in relation to identified safety and performance objectives and thresholds. You'll want to compare any adverse events to adverse events identified in the IFU and risk documentation. If there are any new or unidentified risks, be sure to explain. You'll want to examine if the safety and performance of your subject device still aligns with any identified equivalent or similar devices, and then update the risk-benefit analysis to support device safety and performance. Within the CER, you will also want to reference appropriate external PMCF documents such as the PMCF report and the PMCF plan. Earlier, we touched on other documents that will need to be updated with PMCF data. The PSUR should include a high-level summary of the PMCF data, and any new or unidentified risks should be described. The SSCP should include a description of PMCF activities and results and summarize adverse events and risks. And finally, risk management documentation should be updated to reflect any new or unidentified risks. Ultimately, PMCF must be addressed under the MDR, and the requirements for PMCF are much stricter than under MDD. The main goals of PMCF are to confirm device safety and performance, ensure continued acceptability of identified risks, and detect emerging risks on the basis of factual evidence. We hope that this webinar has been informative and helpful. Please use the contact information on this slide to reach out with any inquiries. Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to hearing from you.